The finality of it was a cold, smooth stone in her palm. Vashti's hand closed around the $3 silver, the metal already warming to her skin, feeling like a betrayal. The sun was a mere suggestion, a pale wash of rose and gray behind the jagged peaks of the Redemption Mountains. At this hour, the town of Jericho was still asleep, a collection of dark, silent shapes. But the horse trader, Mr. Griggs, was always awake for a desperate bargain. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled in the frosty dirt near her worn-out boots. "You're sure about this, Mrs. Thorne?" he asked, his voice a gravelly mix of pity and avarice. He held the lead rope to Dawn, her last horse, her last tangible connection to the life she and Robert had dreamed of. Vashti kept her eyes on the mare. Dawn was a sturdy, gentle-eyed buckskin, her coat the color of honey and dust. Robert had bought her as a wedding present, a promise of a future filled with wide-open spaces and a string of fine horses. Now, she was worth $3 and a sack of flour. Vashti could feel the answer to Griggs's question lodged in her throat, a knot of grief and shame. But her son, Leo, had coughed through the night again, and their food stores were down to a handful of beans and the heel of a stale loaf. Pride was a luxury she had sold off months ago. "I'm sure," she said, her voice thin in the cold air. She did not look at Griggs. She couldn't. Instead, she reached out and ran her hand one last time down Dawn's soft nose. The mare nickered, a low, questioning sound, and nudged her palm, searching for the apple that wasn't there. A fresh wave of sorrow threatened to break over her, but she walled it off, building the dam of necessity higher and stronger. She had become an expert at building that dam. "She's a good horse," Vashti whispered. The words meant only for Dawn. "Be good for him." Griggs grunted, already turning, leading the mare toward his crowded, muddy corral. He didn't care if the horse was good. He only cared that he'd bought her for a quarter of what she was worth. Vashti watched until Dawn was just another silhouette among many, her unique shape swallowed by the herd. Then she turned her back, the 3 coins a heavy, miserable weight in her pocket, and began the long walk back to the tiny rented cabin at the edge of town that was slowly becoming a prison. The walk was a familiar penance. She passed the silent smithy, the dark windows of the mercantile, the imposing clapboard facade of the Jericho First Baptist Church, where the town's matriarch, Mrs. Gable, held court every Sunday, her gaze always seeming to find Vashti and find her wanting. Vashti kept her head down, her shawl pulled tight. The town had never truly accepted her or Robert. He was a dreamer, they whispered, a man with big plans and no backing. And she was the quiet woman from back east who read books and knew more about herbs than was considered proper. When Robert died of a fever that swept through the valley 2 winters ago, the whispers turned to pity and then to a cold, dismissive silence. Her cabin was little more than a shack, with wind finding its way through the chinks in the log walls. Inside, 5-year-old Leo was still asleep on his pallet by the cold hearth, a thin blanket pulled up to his chin. His face was pale, his breathing a little too shallow. She touched his forehead. Not warm, thank God. She stoked the embers in the hearth, adding the last of their precious firewood, and set a small pot of water to boil. It would have to be watered-down oatmeal for breakfast, but at least it would be warm. She laid the $3 silver on the rough-hewn table. They looked small and insignificant. This was the price of her last link to a life of hope. This was the cost of survival. She looked at her son, his small chest rising and falling, and knew she would have sold her own soul for the same amount. The horse was a small sacrifice in comparison, but oh, how it ached. She sat down at the table, the weariness not just in her bones but in her spirit, and waited for the sun to rise on a day she already dreaded. By noon, the day had settled into a grim rhythm. Vashti had bought the flour, a small slab of salt pork, and a bag of beans, the coins vanishing from her purse with alarming speed. She spent the rest of the morning kneading dough, the familiar motion a small comfort. The smell of baking bread filled the tiny cabin, a scent of home and hearth that felt like a lie. Leo, awake now, sat at the table, quietly whittling a piece of scrap wood with a small blunt knife she allowed him. He hadn't asked about Dawn. He knew. His silence was worse than any question. He had his father's eyes, dark and serious, and they seemed to see right through her, to the hollow space where her hope used to be. She was pulling the first loaf from the small oven set into the hearth when the knock came. It was a firm, resonant sound, not the timid rap of a neighbor or the impatient bang of the landlord. Vashti froze, her hand hovering over the bread. No one ever came to their door. Her first thought was of trouble. Trouble was the only visitor who ever seemed to find them. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron, her heart starting a low, anxious drumbeat. "Leo, stay there," she murmured, her voice tight. She cracked the door open a few inches, peering out. The man on her doorstep blocked the midday sun, casting a long shadow that fell over her worn threshold. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dusty but well-made rancher's clothes, a leather vest over a dark shirt, denim trousers tucked into scuffed boots. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing a stern, sun-weathered face and dark, intense eyes that seemed to take in the entire state of her poverty in a single glance. She recognized him instantly. Everyone in Jericho knew Silas. He owned the Bar S, the largest ranch in the territory, a sprawling empire of cattle and horses. He was a man of immense power and few words, a respected but remote figure who had sealed himself off after his own wife died years ago. And standing beside him, her lead rope held loosely in his large gloved hand, was Dawn. Vashti's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced. Had Griggs complained? Was there some law she'd broken? Had she somehow sold a horse that wasn't hers to sell? Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She clutched the edge of the door, her knuckles white. Silas's gaze was unsettlingly direct. He looked from her to the horse, then back to her. His expression was unreadable, a mask of hardened control. "Mrs. Thorne," he said. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, a low rumble like distant thunder. It was not unkind, but it held no warmth. "Mr. Silas," she managed, her voice a mere whisper. She couldn't take her eyes off Dawn, who was placidly chewing her bit, oblivious to the turmoil she was causing. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Vashti could hear the clink of the bit, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the frantic beating of her own heart. Finally, Silas spoke again, his words measured and deliberate, as if he were weighing each one. "My foreman was in town this morning," he began, his eyes fixed on her face. "He saw you at Griggs's. He told me you sold this horse." Vashti could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She braced herself for the accusation, the condemnation. "He also said," Silas continued, his gaze unwavering, "that your late husband used to say you had a better way with sick animals than any vet in the territory." This surprised her. She hadn't realized anyone remembered Robert's proud boasts, or paid them any mind. A flicker of warmth, a memory of her husband's loving, sometimes embarrassing praise, touched her. "I have a colt," Silas said, getting to the point. "A promising one. He has a lung fever." The doc came out, gave him a wash, and said to prepare for the worst. "The colt is worth $500 on the hoof. I am not a man who likes preparing for the worst." He paused, and for the first time, his gaze dropped from her face to the ground, as if the admission cost him something. When he looked up again, the mask was back in place. "I will pay you $10, more than triple what Griggs gave you, to come to the ranch and look at him. And you can have your mare back, as a loan. If the colt lives, you can keep her." He extended the lead rope toward her. That is my question. Will you come? Vashti stared at the rope, then at the man holding it. It wasn't charity. It was a business proposition, stark and clear. He was a powerful man, but he was also a damaged one, a man who had a need he could not fill himself. He was offering her not a handout, but a job. He was offering her a chance to earn back what she had lost. And more than that, he was offering her Dawn. She looked past him at the mare, her heart aching with a sudden fierce hope. Then she looked back at Silas, at the challenge and the desperation mingling in his dark eyes. She thought of Leo's quiet sadness, of the cloying scent of poverty that clung to their clothes, their hair, their lives. She had been given a terrible hand, but for the first time in a long time, someone was offering her a new card to play. Taking a deep breath, she reached out and took the leather rope from his hand. Yes, she said, her voice clear and steady. I will. The Bar S Ranch was not just a piece of land, it was a kingdom. The road to it wound for miles out of Jericho, climbing into the foothills where the air grew thinner and smelled of pine and sage. Vashti rode Dawn, with Leo perched securely in front of her, his small hands clutching the saddle horn. Silas rode beside them on a powerful black stallion that moved with a restless energy, a perfect reflection of its rider. He had not spoken more than a handful of words since they left her cabin, his silence as vast and intimidating as the landscape around them. Vashti felt the weight of his presence, and the weight of the task ahead. She was not a veterinarian. Her knowledge was a tapestry woven from her mother's lessons, old herb books, and a quiet, intuitive understanding of animals that she couldn't explain. It had always been a private skill, something she used for their own livestock. To have it called upon by a man like Silas, with so much at stake, was terrifying. Her self-doubt was a constant whispering voice, telling her she was a fraud, that she would fail, that she was foolish to have agreed. But then she would feel the solid warmth of Dawn beneath her, feel Leo's small body leaning back against hers, and she knew she'd had no other choice. The ranch headquarters came into view, nestled in a wide, protected valley. A massive barn, bigger than any building in Jericho, stood beside a two-story ranch house built of thick, dark logs. Corrals, outbuildings, and a bunkhouse were laid out with an air of permanence and prosperity. It was a world away from her drafty cabin. As they rode into the main yard, ranch hands stopped their work to stare. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Vashti felt their eyes on her, and she pulled her shawl tighter, her spine straightening with a defensive pride. Silas dismounted in a single fluid motion. "Jed," he called out, and a grizzled, bow-legged foreman detached himself from the wall of the barn. "Take Mrs. Thorne's boy to the cookhouse. Tell Martha to give him some milk and pie." Leo looked at her with wide, uncertain eyes. Vashti knelt down. "It's all right, sweet boy. You go with this man. I'll be along soon." She gave him a reassuring smile she did not feel. As Jed led Leo away, Silas turned to her. "The colt is in the sick stall. This way." He led her into the cavernous barn. The air inside was warm and thick with the scent of hay, horses, and linseed oil. In a large, isolated stall bedded with fresh straw, a beautiful chestnut colt lay on its side. Its coat was damp with sweat, its flanks heaving with the effort of each ragged breath. A low, wheezing sound came from its chest. Its eyes were dull with fever. Vashti's fear receded, replaced by a focused calm. Here, in the presence of sickness, she knew what to do. She slipped into the stall, ignoring Silas, who leaned against the door, his arms crossed, watching her every move. She spoke to the colt in a low, soothing murmur, her voice the one she used for Leo when he was frightened. She ran a hand gently over its neck, feeling the heat radiating from its skin. She lifted its eyelid. The membrane was inflamed. She laid her ear against its chest, listening to the congested rattle in its lungs. She worked for several minutes in silence. The colt, which had been restless, seemed to quiet under her touch. Finally, she stood and turned to Silas. "It's lung fever, as you said," she stated, her voice professional, devoid of the uncertainty she felt inside. "The vet's wash would have done nothing but make him cold. He needs warmth, inside and out, and something to break the fever and clear his chest." Silas's expression didn't change. "And you can provide that?" "I can try," she said honestly. "I need a large kettle of boiling water, and I'll need access to your wife's old herb garden if it's still there. I need yarrow, mullein, and willow bark." A flicker of something, pain, memory, crossed his face at the mention of his wife, so quickly that she almost missed it, but he only nodded, his jaw tight. "Jed will get you the water. The garden is behind the main house. It's overgrown, but the plants are still there." For the next few hours, Vashti worked with a singular purpose. She harvested the herbs, her fingers recognizing the leaves and stems by feel. She crushed the yarrow and mullein into a thick, fragrant poultice, and steeped the willow bark into a bitter tea. The ranch hands watched from a distance, their skepticism warring with a grudging respect for her quiet competence. She showed Silas how to hold the colt's head while she gently spooned the willow bark tea into its mouth. His large, calloused hands, which could surely break a man, were surprisingly gentle. Then she spread the warm poultice over the colt's chest, covering it with a clean cloth and a warm blanket. Lastly, she had Jed bring in buckets of steaming water, adding crushed eucalyptus leaves she'd carried in her own small medicine pouch. The steam filled the stall, carrying the sharp medicinal scent. "Now," she said, her work finally done, "we wait." She sat on an overturned bucket just outside the stall, too tired and too anxious to leave. Silas did not return to the main house. He stood his silent vigil, leaning against a support beam, his hat shadowing his face. The afternoon light slanted through the barn doors, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. The only sounds were the rustle of straw and the colt's labored breathing. Hours passed. The sun set, and Jed brought them lanterns. He also brought 2 tin plates with roast beef and potatoes, and a mug of coffee for Silas. For Vashti, he brought a cup of hot, sweet tea. "Figured you could use this," he muttered, not quite meeting her eyes. "That colt, he's a good one." It was the first crack in the wall of their doubt. Sometime deep in the night, the rhythm of the colt's breathing began to change. The wheezing lessened, replaced by a deeper, steadier sound. Vashti, who had been dozing with her head against the stall door, was instantly awake. She slipped inside. The colt was still lying down, but its head was up. It looked at her, and for the first time, its eyes were clear. She laid a hand on its neck. The burning heat was gone, replaced by a natural warmth. The fever had broken. A quiet sound made her turn. Silas was standing in the doorway of the stall, his face illuminated by the lantern light. He looked from the colt to her, and the rigid control he held so tightly seemed to slip. In his eyes, she saw not the powerful ranch owner, but a man who had been prepared for loss and was stunned by a reprieve. "The fever's broken," she said softly. He didn't speak. He just nodded. A slow, deliberate motion. He looked at her tired face, her hands stained with herbs, and a long, unreadable expression passed over his features. He had watched her work, watched her prove herself not with words, but with action. And in the quiet, lantern-lit barn, something shifted between them. The transaction was complete, but a new, more complicated ledger had just been opened. In the days that followed, the colt's recovery was the talk of the Bar S. It was on its feet by the next afternoon, nickering for its mother. Silas said nothing about Vashti leaving. The $10 appeared on the small table in her temporary room in the main house, but the question of her departure hung in the air. On the third day, Silas found her in the corral, grooming Dawn. Leo was nearby, happily filling water troughs with a small bucket. The boy had blossomed in the open space of the ranch, his pale cheeks gaining a healthy color. "The mare is yours, Mrs. Thorne," Silas said, his voice coming from directly behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. "You held up your end of the bargain." Vashti continued her rhythmic brushing, her knuckles brushing against the horse's warm hide. "Thank you, Mr. Silas." "I have another proposition for you," he said. She stopped brushing and turned to face him. He wasn't looking at her, but out at the vast expanse of his land. "The colt is not the only valuable animal on this ranch. And you have a skill. There's an old line cabin down by the creek. It's small, but it's sturdy. Better than what you have in town. You and the boy could live there. I'll pay you a regular wage to look after the health of my horses. You would report only to me." Vashti was stunned into silence. A home, a job, safety. He was offering her everything she had lost, everything she had despaired of ever having again. She looked at Leo, who was laughing as a curious foal nudged his hand. She looked at the mountains, their peaks sharp against the brilliant blue sky. This place was already starting to feel more like home than Jericho ever had. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say yes," he said, his gaze finally meeting hers. It was not a command, but a simple statement of fact. And in his eyes she saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen before. A deep, profound loneliness. He needed her skill, yes. But she had the sudden, startling thought that he needed her presence more. "Yes," she said. The move to the line cabin was a quiet rebirth. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms, but it was clean and dry, with a stone fireplace that drew perfectly and a porch that looked out over a winding creek. Silas had 2 of his quietest ranch hands move her meager belongings from town, and they added a new bed for Leo, a sturdy table, and 2 chairs from the main house storerooms. Vashti settled into a new life, a new rhythm. Her days were spent among the horses. She wasn't just tending the sick, she was helping with the gentling of new foals, her quiet patience working a magic the rougher hands couldn't replicate. The ranch hands, who had once been skeptical, now came to her with their questions, treating her with a gruff but genuine respect. She was no longer Mrs. Thorne, the town widow. She was Vashti, the horsewoman. Silas kept his distance, yet he was a constant presence. She would see him watching her from the fence of the round pen as she worked with a difficult filly. She would find a neat stack of fresh-cut firewood by her door before dawn, though she never heard it being delivered. One evening, she was struggling to fix the cabin's broken porch step, frustrated and near tears. The next morning, a new step, perfectly cut and fitted from a solid piece of cedar, was in its place. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The gesture spoke volumes, a quiet acknowledgement that went deeper than any compliment. One night, he worked late in the ranch office, a single lamp burning a yellow square in the darkness of the main house. She could see it from her own cabin window. On impulse, she poured a cup of the chamomile and lavender tea she brewed for herself to help her sleep, added a spoonful of honey, and carried it across the yard. She knocked softly on the office door. He called to enter without looking up from the ledger he was poring over. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. "I thought you might need this," she said, placing the steaming mug on the corner of his desk. He looked up, surprised. His eyes went from the cup to her face. For a moment, the powerful rancher was gone, and she saw only a weary, lonely man. "Thank you, Vashti," he said, and the way he said her name, soft and low, sent a strange warmth through her. He took a sip of the tea, and a small, almost imperceptible sigh escaped him. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long moment, the only sound the scratching of his pen and the chirp of crickets outside. In that shared quiet, a fragile bridge was built between his world and hers. The slow burn of their connection intensified during the autumn horse drive. A wild Mustang stallion had been brought in, a magnificent beast of smoke and fire that had kicked its way through 2 fences and injured a ranch hand. The men were for breaking him the old way, with force and exhaustion. "Let me try," Vashti said to Silas, as they stood watching the furious horse circle the round pen. He looked at her, then at the dangerous animal. "He could kill you." "So could your method," she countered gently. "It will just take longer, and you'll have a broken horse, not a partner." He studied her face for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. 1 hour. She entered the pen alone, armed with nothing but a bucket of sweet oats and her own stillness. She didn't approach the horse. She simply stood in the center, her posture relaxed, and waited. The stallion charged, thundering toward her, only to veer away at the last second, testing her. She didn't flinch. This dance continued for the better part of the hour, a battle of wills fought with silence and nerve. Gradually, the horse's charges became less aggressive, its circles tighter. It was curiosity, not rage, that now fueled it. Suddenly, a length of loose rope spooked the stallion. It reared, its hooves flashing in the sun, its shadow falling over her. Before she could react, the gate to the pen flew open and Silas was there. He moved with a speed she wouldn't have thought possible, his arm hooking around her waist, pulling her back against his chest as the stallion came down where she had just been standing. The danger passed in an instant, but they remained frozen. Her back was pressed flush against the solid wall of his chest. His arm was a band of iron around her. She could feel the frantic beat of his heart. Or maybe it was her own. She could smell the scent of leather and dust and the clean, masculine scent that was uniquely him. For a breathless moment, the world narrowed to that single point of contact. Neither of them breathed. The ache of longing, so long suppressed, was suddenly sharp and undeniable. He let her go as quickly as he had grabbed her, stepping back as if burned. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. "I'm fine," she whispered, though she was shaking. The stallion, its agitation forgotten, had lowered its head and was tentatively sniffing the bucket of oats. The moment was broken, but the memory of his touch, of that brief, fierce protection, lingered long after. It was this growing closeness, this quiet partnership, that brought the serpent into their Eden. Mrs. Gable, the self-appointed guardian of Jericho's social order, arrived at the Bar S one afternoon in her polished buggy, ostensibly to discuss the church's fall charity drive. She had a pinched, sour face and eyes that missed nothing. Her niece, a simpering girl named Penelope, was her chosen match for the territory's most eligible widower, and she did not appreciate complications. She found Silas and Vashti in the main corral, working together to fit a new shoe on a mare. Vashti was holding the horse's head, murmuring to it, while Silas worked the forge. They moved in easy concert, a team. "Silas, my dear," Mrs. Gable called out, her voice falsely sweet. "I had no idea you'd taken to doing your own smithing, and with such rustic help." Her gaze swept over Vashti's dusty dress and herb-stained fingers with open disdain. Silas straightened up from the anvil, his face hardening. "Mrs. Gable, this is Vashti Thorne. She manages my horses." "Ah, yes, the widow," Mrs. Gable said, the word dripping with condescension. "I'm sure it's a great comfort to have a purpose. A woman alone must be so careful of her station." She turned her back on Vashti, linking her arm through Silas's. "Now, Silas, about the harvest dance. Penelope is so looking forward to you partnering her for the first waltz." Vashti felt the sting as if she'd been slapped. She saw the storm gather in Silas's eyes, the tightening of his jaw. But before he could speak, she handed the mare's lead to a nearby hand and walked away, her head held high. She would not let that woman see her pain. But as she walked back to the sanctuary of her small cabin, the cold fear returned. She was just a hired hand, a widow with a past, and Mrs. Gable had just declared war. The whispers started like a dry wind rustling through dead leaves, and soon they grew into a gale. Mrs. Gable was a master of insinuation, planting seeds of doubt and malice throughout Jericho. Vashti Thorne wasn't a healer, she was a charlatan, a country witch using folk remedies to trick a grieving, vulnerable man. She wasn't just managing his horses, she was managing the rancher himself, worming her way into his affections, trying to trap him, a woman of no standing reaching far above her station. The town doctor, a pompous man named Bellows, whose pride was still smarting from the colt's recovery, eagerly joined the chorus. He spoke darkly of her potions and unclean practices, hinting that she was a danger to the community's health and moral fiber. The gossip found fertile ground in the small, closed minds of the town. Women who had started to nod at her in the street now turned their backs. The mercantile owner was suddenly short on the specific threads she needed. The world, which had started to open up, was closing in again. Vashti felt the change in the atmosphere whenever she had to ride into town for supplies. She felt the stares, heard the hushed conversations that stopped when she drew near. She tried to ignore it, to hold her head high and draw strength from her work, from Leo's happiness, from the quiet sanctuary of the Bar S. But the poison was insidious. Worse, she felt Silas pulling away. He grew more silent, more remote. The easy companionship they had begun to build was replaced by a tense formality. He was the ranch owner. She was the employee. The firewood still appeared by her door, but he no longer sought her out in the evenings. He was being pressured by the town elders, by the preacher, by Mrs. Gable's constant, cloying presence. His family name, his standing in the community, was being weighed against his association with her. Vashti saw the conflict in his eyes, and it terrified her. She had seen him retreat behind his wall of cold control before, and she feared he was doing it again, leaving her on the outside. The threat, when it finally struck home, was not aimed at her, but at her son. It started with a cough, a small dry hack that she told herself was just from the autumn dust, but then came the fever. By nightfall, Leo was hot to the touch, his breathing shallow and ragged. Vashti's blood ran cold. She knew this fever. It was the same wheezing, lung-seizing sickness that had almost taken the colt. Panic warred with her training. She was the healer, the calm authority. But this was not a horse. This was her son, her entire world. She worked through the night, her hands shaking as she prepared the same remedies she had used before. She brewed the willow bark tea, but Leo was too weak to drink much of it. She made the mullein poultice, but his small chest still rattled with each painful breath. By the second day, he was worse. He was listless, his eyes glassy with fever. He barely responded to her voice. The terror she had been holding at bay broke through its dam and washed over her. Her knowledge felt useless, her herbs like dried, powerless weeds. Her self-doubt, a voice she had silenced for months, screamed at her now. She was a fraud, a witch, a failure. She was going to lose him, just as she had lost Robert. In a moment of pure desperation, she sent one of the younger ranch hands, a boy named Tim, to ride into town and fetch Dr. Bellows. She swallowed her pride, her fear of his scorn, everything. Nothing mattered but Leo. Tim returned 2 hours later, his face pale and angry. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "He won't come, Mrs. Thorne," he mumbled, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. He said he won't be called out to treat the child of a woman who dabbles in witchcraft. He said you should try one of your own cures." The cruelty of it stole her breath. It was a death sentence, delivered with sanctimonious pride. Mrs. Gable's whispers had become the town's verdict. Vashti stood on her porch, the doctor's words echoing in the vast, indifferent silence of the prairie. She was utterly alone, watching her son die, and the town was content to let it happen. This was her lowest point. The despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her, crushing the air from her lungs. She looked at the main house where a light burned in Silas's window. He had retreated from her, from this trouble she had brought to his door. With a shaking hand, she scrawled a note. Her last resort. It was not a plea for help. It was a surrender. She told him Leo was sick, that she had brought nothing but trouble to his ranch, and that as soon as her son was well enough to travel, they would be gone. She gave the note to Jed, her face a mask of numb grief. The connection she had thought was building between them was an illusion. It was over. Silas stood in the main street of Jericho, the dust swirling around his boots. He had just come from a meeting with the town council, a meeting that had devolved into a thinly veiled lecture from the preacher and Mrs. Gable about his associations and his responsibilities to his station. He felt cornered, the clean, open air of his ranch replaced by the stifling, small-minded atmosphere of the town. He was retreating, just as Vashti feared, pulling the comfortable, cold armor of his grief and solitude back around himself. It was easier than fighting. It was safer. He was turning to mount his horse when Jed galloped into town, his horse lathered and heaving. The old foreman's face was grim. He thrust Vashti's note into Silas's hand without a word. Silas read the few, scrawled lines. Leo is sick. I am sorry for the trouble. We will be gone soon. The words were a punch to the gut. Gone. The thought was a physical jolt, as if the ground had shifted beneath him. At the same moment, he overheard two women gossiping outside the mercantile. Serves her right, one of them sniffed, the one who worked for Mrs. Gable. Playing the doctor. Dr. Bellows told her himself. He won't go near that place. Let her witch's brew save the boy. Something inside Silas snapped. The armor he had so carefully reconstructed shattered into 1,000 pieces. The cruelty of it. The smug, self-righteous cruelty aimed at a woman and her sick child. And he, in his silence and his withdrawal, had been complicit. He thought of his own son, of the fever he couldn't break, of the helplessness and the guilt that had hollowed him out for years. He looked at the smug faces of the town, at the church steeple, at the doctor's office, and he saw it all for the rotten, hypocritical sham it was. He didn't say a word. He swung himself onto his stallion and spurred it into a gallop, leaving the town and its judgment choking in his dust. He rode not like a man going to a crisis, but like a man fleeing a prison, a man who had finally been shown the key. He burst into Vashti's cabin without knocking. The scene inside stopped his heart. Vashti was kneeling on the floor, her face ashen, her body trembling with exhaustion. She was holding Leo, who was wrapped in blankets, his small form terrifyingly still. The air was thick with the smell of sickness and despair. Vashti looked up as he entered, her eyes wide and haunted, devoid of hope. She looked like a woman who had already accepted the worst. This was the moment he could offer empty words of comfort and then retreat to his big, empty house. The moment he could let her go, as her note had offered. It was the rational choice, the safe choice. He did not take it. He crossed the room in 2 strides, shrugging out of his heavy duster and tossing it aside. He knelt in front of her, his presence filling the small, desperate space. "Tell me what you need," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. Vashti stared at him, uncomprehending. "He's so cold," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't get him warm." "Then we will get him warm," Silas said. He rolled up his sleeves. He looked around the room at the scattered herbs, the cold kettle, the disarray of a losing battle. "You are the healer here, Vashti. I am just your hands. Tell me what to do." His absolute, unquestioning faith was the spark that reignited her own. It cut through the fog of her fear and despair. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the powerful rancher, but a partner, an ally. "The fire," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Build it up, as hot as you can get it. And I need more water, boiling, and the eucalyptus leaves from my pouch on the mantel." He moved with a quiet, efficient purpose, his large frame surprisingly agile in the cramped cabin. He coaxed the fire into a roaring blaze, hauled in buckets of water, his presence a solid, grounding force. As he worked, Vashti continued to hold Leo, murmuring to him, her own strength returning with every command she gave Silas. With the cabin now blessedly warm and steam filling the air from the kettles, she decided on one last desperate course of action. She would create a steam tent over Leo, a concentrated dose of the healing eucalyptus vapor. It was a risk. It could shock his system. But doing nothing was a greater risk. "I need to make a tent over him," she explained, her voice steady now. "We need to hold a blanket over the bed to trap the steam." They worked together, a silent practice team. He held one side of the heavy wool blanket, she held the other, creating a small enclosed space over the sleeping child. The hot, moist, medicated air filled the tent. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, their arms aching, sweat beading on their brows, listening to the faint, ragged sound of Leo's breathing. In the suffocating closeness of the tent, with the world narrowed to the space of a child's sickbed, the last of Silas's walls crumbled. "My son," he said, his voice so low she barely heard him over the crackle of the fire. His name was Samuel. He had a fever like this. The doctor came. He did things. Nothing worked. My wife, Eleanor, she held him, just like you're doing. I stood there. I just stood there. I didn't know what to do. I watched him slip away, and I never forgave myself for just standing there." Tears streamed down his face, silent and unashamed. He was not just helping her save Leo, he was reliving his own greatest failure, and this time, he was not standing by. He was acting. He was holding the blanket. Vashti's own tears began to fall, for his loss, for her fear, for this terrible, beautiful moment of shared humanity. "You're not just standing there now, Silas," she whispered. They stayed like that, holding the blanket, holding the space for healing, until their muscles screamed in protest. Finally, Vashti felt a change, a subtle shift in the rhythm of Leo's breathing. She lowered the blanket. Leo stirred. He coughed, a deep, productive cough that rattled his small frame. Then he took a deep, clear breath. His eyes fluttered open. He looked at his mother, a flicker of recognition in his gaze. A light sheen of healthy sweat had broken out on his forehead. "Mama?" he whispered, his voice weak but his own. The fever had broken. Vashti sobbed, a raw, wrenching sound of pure relief, gathering her son into her arms. Silas let his side of the blanket fall. He stepped back, his face streaked with tears and soot, and watched them. He had pulled her from the depths of her despair, and in doing so, she had pulled him from the tomb of his grief. The rescue was mutual. A week later, the world was transformed. The late autumn sun warmed the porch of the cabin, and the sound of Leo's laughter, clear and strong, echoed from the creek bed where he was attempting to teach a stray puppy to fetch a stick. He was thin, but his color was good, his energy boundless. The sickness felt like a distant, terrible dream. Vashti sat on the porch step, mending a tear in one of Leo's shirts, her needle moving in a steady, calming rhythm. The quiet hum of life on the ranch had returned, but something fundamental had shifted. The ranch hands treated her with a new level of reverence. Jed now brought her a cup of tea every morning, whether she was in the barn or not. The invisible wall between her cabin and the main house had dissolved. She looked up as a horse and rider approached, and her heart gave a familiar little skip. It was Silas. But he wasn't on his formidable black stallion. He was riding Dawn, her gentle buckskin, the horse that had started it all. The sight of him, so large and powerful on her small, unassuming mare, was a paradox that made perfect sense. He dismounted and looped Dawn's reins over the porch railing. He didn't have the stern, guarded look of the ranch owner. He looked settled, at peace. He held his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over. For the first time she could remember, Silas seemed nervous. "He looks well," Silas said, nodding toward Leo. His voice was quiet. "He is," Vashti replied, her own voice soft. "Thanks to you." "No," he said, shaking his head. "Thanks to you. I just held the blanket." An easy silence fell between them, the kind that no longer needed to be filled. Finally, he cleared his throat and reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I was in town yesterday," he said, "at the land office." He unfolded the paper and held it out to her. It was a deed. Her eyes scanned the legal language, but the names jumped out at her. The Bar S Ranch, granting ownership of the line cabin and 10 acres of land surrounding it, to one Vashti Thorne. She looked up at him, her heart pounding. "Silas, I can't accept this." "Why not?" he asked, his gaze steady. "A woman needs a place of her own, a place no one can run her out of, a place to put down roots." He paused. "I should have stood up to them sooner, Vashti. In town. I let my fear of their judgment, of stirring up my own past, keep me silent. That won't happen again." She looked at the deed in her hand, at the solid black ink that declared this piece of the frontier hers. It was security. It was respect. It was a home. She looked at him, at his earnest, open face, and saw that it was also an apology and a promise. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She folded the paper carefully and set it on the step beside her. "And the rancher?" she asked, her eyes meeting his. "What does he need?" A slow smile spread across his face, a sight so rare and beautiful it took her breath away. It transformed his stern features, erasing the lines of grief and loneliness. "He needs a partner," Silas said, his voice rough with feeling. "Someone to help with the horses. Someone to drink tea with when the ledgers get too long. Someone to share the silence with. Someone." He took a step closer, his eyes full of a future she was just beginning to let herself imagine, to build a home with. He didn't make any grand pronouncements or flowery speeches. He simply stood before her, vulnerable and open, his need laid bare. He held out his large, calloused hand. Vashti looked from his hand to his face, and then at her son, who was now running through the tall grass with his puppy, his laughter carrying on the breeze. This was it. The place where all the broken pieces of her life finally fit together into a new, stronger whole. The frontier was still wild, the town of Jericho was still full of whispers, but here, in this small valley, under the watchful gaze of the mountains, she was no longer alone. She had found her shelter. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. The fit was perfect. They stood there on the porch of her home, their hands clasped, watching the sun begin to set, painting the sky in the same shades of rose and gray as the dawn when she had sold her last horse. But this time, it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning.